right, let's dive into one of history's most bizarre and, honestly, tragic disasters. Because on October 17th, 1814, the city of London wasn't hit by fire or floodwaters. No, it was hit by something way, way stranger.
So I want you to picture this. Over 300,000 gallons of liquid, suddenly, in an instant, just unleashed in the heart of the city. That's enough to fill half an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Just poof.
And we're not talking about a refreshing cold drink here. Oh, no. This was a massive tidal wave of hot, 10-month-old fermenting porter. You know, that dark, stout-like beer. This was an industrial accident on a scale that is just wild to even think about.
Right, that's the question, isn't it? How does a beer flood actually kill people? Well, the answer, it's a pretty grim story of incredible industrial power, crushing poverty, and what you can only call staggering corporate negligence.
To even get your head around how a beer flood is possible, you have to look at the setting, because it was a powder keg. You've got this colossal, state-of-the-art brewery looming directly over one of London's most desperate and run-down slums.
So on one side of a wall, you've got the magnificent Horse Shoe Brewery. This place was a titan of industry, a real symbol of the wealth and power of the Industrial Revolution. And then, literally in its shadow, you had the St. Giles Rookery. This place was the polar opposite, a maze of extreme poverty full of Irish immigrants and London's poorest citizens, all crammed into basements and crumbling buildings.
The area was so infamous, it even got its own charming little nickname. They called it a rookery because of how people were packed in together, just like birds in a crowded nest. But it was also street slang for cheating and stealing. I mean, this was a place so rough, so dangerous, that even the local law enforcement often didn't want to go in there.
Okay, so let's get to the day of the disaster, October 17th, 1814, and see how this all went so incredibly wrong.
The chain of events here is just a masterclass in, it'll be fine. At 4:30 in the afternoon, a clerk spots that a 700-pound iron hoop, one of the giant metal bands holding a 22-foot-high vat together, has just snapped. He tells his supervisor, who says, and I quote, "No harm whatever would ensue." His solution? Just write a memo about it. An hour later, the whole thing explodes.
Now, what's really crazy is the sheer force we're talking about. That first explosion wasn't just a leak. It was so powerful, it blew the valve off another huge vat and smashed several other large barrels to pieces. All of that beer joined the flood, turning a massive spill into an absolute tsunami.
We're talking about a 15-foot-high wave of beer, wood, and debris. It was so strong, it blasted right through the brewery's own 25-foot-high brick wall and just surged into the narrow streets of the St. Giles Rookery.
A newspaper at the time didn't describe it like a spill, they described it like a natural disaster. The destruction was so complete, they were comparing it to the aftermath of a massive fire or an earthquake.
And this is where the story stops being just a weird historical anecdote and becomes a real tragedy. Because that wave of beer didn't just fill the streets, it crashed directly into the homes of the city's most vulnerable people.
Now, there's a myth that people died trying to scoop up all the free beer. And that's not what happened. The flood ripped through basement homes and killed entire families. 8 people died, and as you can see, they were all women and young children.
You want to talk about dark irony? In one basement, an Irish family was holding a wake for their 2-year-old son who had just died. The beer flood poured into that cellar, trapping and drowning the little boy's mother and 4 other people who were there to mourn him.
These weren't just names on a list. Eleanor Cooper was 14 years old. She was a servant at a pub, just washing pots in the yard, when the brewery wall came down and crushed her instantly. These were just normal people, going about their day with no idea an industrial catastrophe was literally brewing next door.
So let's talk about the aftermath. Because if you think the flood itself was unbelievable, the legal and financial fallout, well, that's where this story gets truly infuriating.
An official inquest was held just 2 days later. And the verdict? The jury decided that all 8 deaths happened casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. The whole thing, a snapped iron hoop on a giant man-made vat, was officially ruled an act of God.
No, seriously.
So because it was an act of God, the brewery wasn't held responsible for anything. They paid 0 compensation to the families. In fact, some of the families were so poor they had to put the bodies of their loved ones on display just to collect donations for a proper burial. Meanwhile, the brewery, They went to Parliament and got a tax rebate for about £7,000 for the beer they lost, a government bailout that saved the company from going bankrupt.
If there's any silver lining at all to this whole mess, it's that the entire brewing industry was pretty much forced to admit that maybe, just maybe, enormous wooden vats held together by iron hoops were a really bad idea. They were eventually replaced with much safer concrete tanks. The brewery itself was rebuilt and kept going until 1922, and today the Dominion Theater stands right on that spot.
And to date, the disaster is remembered in the most fitting way possible, with a beer. A pub nearby, the Holborn Whippet, brews a special porter every year on the anniversary to remember the flood and those who lost their lives.
It's a strange legacy, isn't it? The whole event has become this quirky historical fun fact, but it came from a very real, very brutal tragedy that shows you the human cost of progress. It really makes you wonder what other bizarre stories like this are buried right underneath our feet.